to our next presentation. So we are fortunate enough to have Brandi Paniagua and Ariane Porras here to talk to us about how to use some motivational interviewing techniques and healthy coaching practices to build the protective factors that we heard Adrienne talk about earlier this morning. So Brandi is a collaborative coordinator and trainer at the YMCA of San Diego County for Partners in Prevention, which is an initiative to connect families with children between the ages of 0 and 5 with strengths-based, family-centered, trauma-informed services. And Ariane is also a native San Diegan and has worked for many, many years with the YMCA of San Diego County too. And she's also an early childhood mental health consultant and trainer. So she has a lot of expertise in this area as well. So I think, great, they're here.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. So just to start, we wanted to say that we did have to shift our training a little bit, just the content a little bit, just because the original person who was going to train with me had a last-minute emergency. It's still going to be basically the same topic. There just won't be any specific motivational interviewing pieces. But we are going to talk about perspective shifting and the positive childhood experiences. I know a lot of us are familiar with ACEs, and now we're going to talk about the newer information we have about PCEs, which are positive childhood experiences. But as we get into it, it all makes sense, and we will go through some very, I think, important perspective shifting and collaboration methods that we can do with families. So as I said, we're going to talk about ACEs and the protective factors, a light touch on the protective factors, not too much, and then facilitating change talk and the HOPE framework and the positive childhood experiences. So as we go through this, we hope that you'll keep these things in mind. We will be thinking through how we can just decenter our own worldview when talking to families about nutrition, weight, and healthy habits. We're going to be thinking about how we can invite the perspective and values of the family when we're making health goals with them, and what it is about families' culture that is driving their health habits. So kind of thinking about the whole person and their whole experience, and using them as a collaborator versus somebody that we're just kind of trying to coach, right? So it's more like a collaboration versus coaching. And I already got a wonderful introduction, so I won't go into too much about me. I've been with the YMCA for 5 years now, but in social services for 7. And we work with we work with the YMCA of San Diego County, but we work specifically in a federal grant called Partners in Prevention, which focuses on primary prevention and child abuse prevention for San Diego County. We have a very broad spectrum of just work that we do. We're really focused on the community information exchange and trying to streamline the referral process in San Diego, basically implementing shared language, shared referral practices, and shifting all our perspectives to a strengths-based approach. We also have other services that Ariane will get into, and we can provide more information at the end about our program.
Thanks, Brandi. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Really good to be here with you this morning. As we were so beautifully introduced, we're with the YMCA. I've been with the YMCA for over 12 years now, working primarily as an early childhood mental health consultant and trainer. So I've been able to facilitate just awesome discussions around social emotional literacy and foundations, and now trauma-informed care, culturally responsive practices, protective factors, all the really good stuff that we want to keep in mind while we engage with families. And so I get to do that for Partners in Prevention and be here with all of you, which I'm really thankful for. So we're going to start with an activity. I know you guys have been back-to-back speakers. So if you want to take a moment just to stretch and breathe and gather yourself again, because I know it's been an early morning. And just if you want to orient your nervous system to where you are and remind yourself, it's kind of like giving your nervous system a little hug when you look around the room. Just remind yourself where you're at. And then if you can direct your attention to the screen and just look at this picture. And I think for those of us who have been in this field for a while, this might be familiar. And so I just want to ask in the chat if you can engage. What stands out to you when you first see this picture? Just what's the first thing that you see? No interaction with each other, clutter, chaos, mess. Thank you for being so expedient in your answers. Lack of connection, chaos, life. Thank you, Sloan. Adult there with kids, mess, chaos, mess. Yeah, what else? Very good. You are all doing exactly what our brains are made to do, which is look at what's wrong in this picture, right? So yay, good job. Our brains are working as they should, especially under a global pandemic where we're all under this collective trauma. Our brains in this, I think it's in a book called Thinking Fast and Slow that it's highlighted specifically in these terms of type 1 and type 2 thinking, but our brains are wired to do this. It's which is looking for what's wrong and what is the easiest thing to do to exit a situation or to address a situation. And that's exactly what you guys just demonstrated. We need to, our brains are wired for survival, right? And so it's doing exactly that. It's saying, hey, before you settle in and get comfortable, there's some things that need to be addressed in this picture. Okay, so now that we've looked at, yes, I think those are bugs on the walls. So now that we've taken a first glance at this picture, if you can take a look again and look for what is strong or what is good. Look for strengths in this picture. And if you can put that in the chat, I'll give you a minute to do that. The family's together. Mom is reading. Yes, there's togetherness. They're all in the same room. Exactly. Yeah. What else do you see that's strong? There's some religious icons there. Yeah, so they have a sense of belief. Everyone looks relaxed. Good. Pet friendly, spirituality, stimulating environment. Yeah. Yes, it is a very stimulating environment. Cleaning supplies are available. They're cozy. They're together. The pets seem happy. Yes, there's electricity because the TV's on, right? We can see that. Chemicals are available to the children. It's not great, but I guess if a spill happens, they're ready to clean. And there's food available. Yep. Yeah. So see, this is, again, thank you for participating. Thank you for being so engaging. But yes, when we slow down, our brain engages in what is called type 2 thinking, which is we're able to take in the situation a little bit calmer and broader and see that, oh, there is good that it is coexisting with the not so good, right? Because as I think, was it Sloan that you said you saw life, right? Like everything exists at once. Things we like and love, things we don't as much. And so, yeah, this is life. And so it's really important that we take everything into account, right? That we don't just get narrow in our perspective and in our ideas of how we engage with families, because it really just starts creating a deficit-based relationship. And that's not a place where anyone can really thrive. So thank you for joining in that. All right. So we start with ACEs, and I know most of you on this call have either heard that term or are familiar, have a basic understanding of what ACEs is. If you do have like a basic understanding of what it is, you could just put a thumbs up on your reactions. That'll help me to kind of gauge. But yeah, ACEs, as we know, is a study that was done here in San Diego. Thank you for, I love seeing all the thumbs up. And it asked 10 questions based on these 3 types of categories of abuse, right? So abuse is the first one: physical, emotional, and sexual. Neglect, which is also a type of abuse, emotional and physical. And then some questions under household dysfunction, which is, did someone in your house have mental illness? Did you have an incarcerated relative? Was your mother treated violently? Was there substance abuse in the home? And were you did you experience divorce in your family? So the study was conducted with these 10 questions. And if you answered yes, that was 1 point, right? So you could get a score of 1 to 10. The reason this study is so groundbreaking is because, and I think we can go to the next slide, Brandi, is because it takes into account major issues that then lead to longer lasting impact, right? That study initially was done for middle-class white males. And so now that we have that data, which was really helpful, we've been able to expand it more into different types of people groups. And so this is one of the really good illustrations that we see that it's not just those 10 questions that contribute to ACEs, which if you look at this illustration, the branches are the original 10 questions. And now that we've had time to, think about the study over the years, we realize there's also other factors that contribute to this. So the roots are adverse community experiences. So what kind of community is this child growing up in as well that is going to have long-lasting impact, right? So some of those are poor housing quality and affordability, discrimination, and being in communities that there's lack of opportunity and social capital and economic mobility. Right, that's drastically going to affect your sense of safety, and therefore increase your toxic stress levels. We also have atrocious cultural experiences that we know intergenerational trauma is a thing, and so we need to account for that when we think of ACEs. And at the very top, adverse climate experiences, understanding that in the last few years we have been experiencing different changes in our climate, and that brings a whole other level of stress, right? And wondering what is this world going to look like in the next few decades. So taking all of that into account, it's a lot, right? It's a lot for people to carry. And the way that this is then manifested in a person is through toxic stress. And this toxic stress then creates havoc in the body, right? It creates actual long-lasting effects, which we have in our next slide, I believe. Yes. So these are some of the long-lasting effects that we have from ACEs now that we understand. Injury, which is people are going to be prone to more physical injury, right? Because if your system is overtaxed and stressed in a state of toxic stress, then you'll be more likely, you're not going to be as sharp with your reflexes. Mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and PTSD become prevalent. Unintended pregnancies, so maternal health then becomes an issue. Infectious diseases are more prevalent. Chronic diseases are more prevalent. Risky behaviors increase, because this is all, most of these are ways that the body is coping with an unmanageable level of stress in the system, right? And so that's why ACEs was so groundbreaking, because we really understood, oh, it's what we go through that leads to these chronic issues. It's not a moral issue. It's not a lack of willpower, which is how our culture has presented it up to this point, but it's long-lasting effects from trauma. So when families are coming into our programs, we need to have this basic understanding that we don't understand the full picture, that in educating ourselves with these adverse experiences, we understand that there can be a variety and very complicated set of issues that the family is bringing in with them, right? So ACEs showed us that disease is linked to stress and trauma. So in what ways, understanding this, can you frame conversations with families to center around social supports and family well-being? Because if toxic stress and trauma is what leads to long-lasting negative effects, we need to increase those inputs of good things, right? And we know that responsive relationships are the key to healing humans, period. And so in the same way, we want to think about our programs and our staff as modeling that responsiveness that families need to downregulate their system a little bit and be open to learning and healing, right? And that's where our services can be an aid and a support for that. But we really need to be mindful of how we approach these conversations. Are they shame-inducing? Are they blaming? Or are we really helping the family to think about what social supports are available to you? How can you increase those? And what does family well-being mean to you, right? And move from that place. So we're going to look at just a few best practice lenses. It's kind of like a toolbox, right? These are the 4 that we'll look at today: cultural proficiency, being trauma-informed, being strengths-based, which we already did an exercise on that, and then stages of change. So Brandi and I will be teaming up on that. Being trauma-informed. Trauma-informed care has become this buzzword, right? And it's really important because, like we said, understanding ACEs and the things that create long-lasting impacts for children and families is really important. And so trauma-informed care is really about having principles and practices which promote safety, right? Again, what is gonna lower the stress of this family coming in to receive services? So is it a safe relationship that they're engaging with you in? Are they feeling empowered? Are they feeling supported? And this promoting healing, right? Are you addressing trauma in a safe and sensitive way? Again, understanding that the family has more that they're carrying into the situation that you may even be aware of or may hear in your interactions with them. And so we want to start with that basis, right? A lot of us know what neighborhoods we serve, and we target certain populations. And so we should have that basic understanding that these families are carrying in more than they really should be. And so how can we move from that place of helping them feel supported and calm? So recognizing that trauma is prevalent, even in affluent neighborhoods and other groups that maybe aren't targeted. Trauma is prevalent. Everyone experiences it. There's different levels of it, but we're all affected by it. And so how can we engage in a way that is supportive and responsive? That's really what trauma-informed care is. Any thoughts on that? Because I know this term and this movement has been around for a few years now. And so I think maybe there's been conversations around this in our program. So anything that anyone would like to add? Okay, we can keep going. Having a strengths-based approach is super, super important, right? We had this quick exercise that we did where we practiced slowing down our thinking, acknowledging that quick thinking is natural. It's what we're wired to do. So we need not shame ourselves for that either. It's actually, hey, my brain's working as it's meant to. But understanding that our brain has capacity for more, and that slowing down to really take in an entire situation is really important, right? So starting off with the fact that, and reminding ourselves that children and family have strengths, resources, and ability to recover from adversity. I was in a training this week talking about historical trauma, and they mentioned how we always say, oh, it's our families are just like, we want to help them feel resilient. You know, they're just so resilient, and we need to help them build resiliency. And the thing is, they're already really, really resilient, right? So highlighting those strengths that they've already been cultivating is super important, and a much better place to start with when you're engaging with families. So acknowledging that children and families are capable of solving problems and learning new skills. We are just there as supports and providing the entitlements that they're entitled to. Identifying, promoting, and building upon strengths. We know that when we're, which we are right now during this pandemic, we have all been extra stressed, right? Extra taxed in every way possible, and we're just making it through. So in that state of being so wiped out and overly stressed, it's important that we help each other in recognizing each other's strengths, right? Because our brains are not always in a place where we can see it in ourselves very easily. So learning to identify and promote that when we're engaging with families is also going to nurture this engagement that is going to lead to better outcomes. And then using the child's strengths to combat those barriers and challenges, being like, yes, I know that this challenge is coming up, or that you're facing this really big issue, but you have this and you have that, and I have seen this in you. And I think, you know, that's going to make a huge difference in how we can approach this together. Any thoughts on a strength-based approach? Okay. Cultural proficiency is another one that's really important, because especially here in San Diego, I think we are so fortunate to have so many different cultures living in one place. And we see, because we're a border town, we see those cultures shifting and changing. Like now we have this influx of Haitian immigrants, right? And I just think of the ways that that's going to influence and enrich our culture here in San Diego. But we have already so many different groups that have immigrated and come to stay here. And so understanding each person's values are different, and that their sense of well-being and success and resiliency in their family looks a little bit different, is also really key to engaging with these families. So each one is going to have a different cultural need, right, based on their experience. They're going to respect, value, and learn, and so learn from each other's differences, and we need to model that. So thinking of your policies, how can you adapt your policies to celebrate those differences? You know, we do a lot of training with childcare providers because they have such a huge influence in a child's life, right? And so we always encourage them to think of how can your program, the way that you set it up, be celebrating the differences between these kiddos, because each family's culture is different too, right? Yeah, cultural humility, Liliana, understanding that the way that you know, the lens that you have grown up with is not the best way, it's just one way. Absolutely, that's important. And confronting biases and advocating for culture of others. So that's where the type 1 and type 2 thinking is really important to understand as well. And I keep going back to it, is because the type 1 thinking, although it's natural and wired for survival, it is embedded with biases, right? And so the type 2 thinking is where we get to practice letting go of our own biases and thinking about things in a different way, taking other things into consideration, taking other people's culture and how they prioritize life differently. So it's really, like you said, Liliana, a humility that you have to practice, and slowing down and being like, okay, I might be feeling this way because I think this is really important and this is a value that I hold dear. That's not going to be true for everyone else. So what is enough? I need to slow down and understand how they're approaching their sense of well-being. So some ways to discuss these sensitive topics, you know, conversations around BMI and weight can be really sensitive, and you guys have been talking about this all morning. And so we have to think of like, what is truly necessary? And if you do need to have a conversation about that, what are trauma-informed and culturally responsive methods of approaching this topic? Because we know that weight gain, and especially right now during the pandemic where everyone has had an influx, a lot of people have had an influx in weight, we can link that directly to stress and trauma. ACEs shows us that that's linked to stress and trauma. And so it's not because people are just, you know, happily going through this thing. It's because it's taking a toll on our bodies, right? Our bodies are responding to something very, very difficult. And the body is so wise in that it's going to do whatever it can to make you feel okay and calm and regulate. And sometimes that is through food, right? So when you're thinking of this topic, really eliminating that moral failure aspect that I think our culture has put in to our brains so well, and taking inventory of your community and resources that help you better serve them. So first, things like, can you communicate well with a family? If not, do you need to get a translator present, right? To make sure that what you're trying to convey is really resonating with them in the way that you intend it to. Approaching well-being as a broader topic, understanding that everyone considers well-being for themselves a little bit differently. Brandi and I will have different ideas of what well-being means to us, right? And we grew up pretty similarly. So granted, it's going to change throughout different families and experiences and neighborhoods and everything like that. Really buffering or strengthening your engagement with knowledge of parenting and child development. We know that parenting and child development is a protective factor. And so the more that you can help parents in understanding what is appropriate for each age, right? Sometimes the kiddos are going to go for the sweet and all those things because it just feels good, it tastes good, and their brains aren't in a way where they can, they're practicing impulse control when they're 0 to 5. And so helping parents understand some of that child development knowledge is really, really helpful. And then implementing the HOPE framework, which Brandi is going to go into in a bit.
All right. Thank you, Ariane. That was amazing as usual. Is there anything else you'd like to add before I kind of take over? No? Okay. Okay, great. So the last strengths-based approach are the stages of change. So when we're talking to families, often this happens to us in social services, and I'm 100% sure it happens in your offices and things like that when working with patients, but you're trying to facilitate change for somebody, right? And they're just kind of not connecting. It's not connecting. They're resistant, and all that. And some of that is because they may be at a different stage of change. And maybe some of you have familiarity with this kind of way of thinking or approaching change management, but I'm just going to briefly kind of go through it. So the first stage is pre-contemplation. And this is when people don't even know they have a problem. So like they don't know that there's any issue and they're not even thinking about changing. And then we have contemplation, which is, I'm aware that there's a change that needs to be made, but I'm definitely not anywhere near action. And I'm just going to kind of think it through. The possibilities of change. Preparation is when you've decided to make a change and you're starting to work through, you're planning, okay, I got a gym membership. I'm going to start going on Monday, that kind of thinking. And then action is doing it. You're going to the gym, you're doing your thing. And then maintenance is when it's become a habit, right? So I'm able to do this. I'm able to consistently go 3 times a week. And it's a part of my life now. It's a habit I've made. Often we approach people in action mode, right? We're like, oh, okay, these are the things you need to do, or these are the things you need to prepare for, right? So we're in prepare and action. But often people are either in pre-contemplation or contemplation. So they're not ready to meet you there, right? So the point of bringing up the stages of change is to kind of assess people for where they are, right? So if a family comes in and you really need them to start feeding their child more vegetables, right? They really need to introduce more vegetables into the child's diet. Maybe kind of just assess where they are. Do you think it's important to eat vegetables? Do you think your child, is, you brought your child in here to address the need, and I've identified this as kind of a way to combat it. How do we meet the family where they are? So if a family is in pre-contemplation, how can I shift my approach to meet them in pre-contemplation? Maybe I'm just giving them information today. Here's some information to kind of think through. The benefits of eating more vegetables, or ways I can cook vegetables that, will be more enticing to me or easier for me after a long day of work, so that they're kind of getting started to get through the stages of change to finally meet you at action. Does that make sense? That was a mouthful, sorry. All right, great. All right, if there's any questions about that, I'm happy to discuss. I kind of flew through that. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the positive childhood experiences. Ariane gave us a wonderful breakdown of what the ACEs are. A lot of us are familiar with the ACEs, but now we're starting to shift our discussion to include the positive childhood experiences. And so this was also a study that was done that it was interview style, and they asked these 7 questions. So when you were a child, did you feel able to talk to your family about feelings? Was that you feel that your family stood by you during difficult times? Did you enjoy participating in community traditions? Did you feel a sense of belonging in high school? Did you feel supported by friends? Did you have at least 2 non-parent adults who took genuine interest in you? And did you feel safe and protected by an adult in your home? So people answered these questions, and they compared them against their ACEs score, and they found that having 2 or more positive childhood experiences really was able to mitigate the effects of the adverse childhood experiences. So it's not so doom and gloom with ACEs, right? We're a whole person with a variety of experiences. And so having the positive childhood experiences actually can improve health outcomes for folks who are experiencing adverse childhood experiences. And we found that they can affect adult health in a lot of positive ways. So having positive childhood experience helps with resilience and helps build resilience, and then it increases the positive health outcomes. And so out of this study came the HOPE framework. And so HOPE is this, it's a method of creating healthy experiences for children and, sorry, I've got tongue tied for a second, which helps to just build safe environments for children so that we can promote the positive childhood experiences. And so these include relationships, and that includes with other children and through adults and activities. So that includes you all when you're interacting with children and their families. Safe and equitable and stable environments for living, playing, learning. And that also, so environments are an interesting one, because I think that often people think, oh, okay, you mean home life and childcare and schools, right? But it also includes your doctor's offices. It includes offices that you go into to receive social services. All these are environments that impact us, right? I know that when I walk into the doctor's office, I'm impacted by the environment. If it's an open space, I'm greeted warmly, you know, I feel so different than walking in, somebody's like, here's a paper, fill it out. Doctor will be out here in a second, you know, especially when there can be some nerves around the doctor's office, right? So just something to think about, you know, we are working with children and adults who have experienced trauma. So, you know, making a safe and secure environment for them is really just something really basic we can do to ensure that they're coming into an environment where they're feeling welcome and safe. And then engagement, that's social and civic, and it helps to create a sense of belonging, connectedness. I think this is actually a really good way to approach some of the conversations that you're having with families too, because it's a sense of collaboration, right? If I'm engaged with the person that I'm talking to, and I'm engaged with the patient, I'm making a connection, which is so important to not only drawing them in to the conversation and having them participate with you, but also in creating a relationship that down the line, if they're not quite ready to change, you know, maybe a couple visits later, they'll be there with you, and then you can start making those changes or helping them implement those changes. And then the third building block is emotional growth. And that's through playing, interacting, and then self-awareness and self-regulation. So are there any thoughts about the building blocks of hope? We have, this is a very brief touch. We have a whole 90-minute training on this. So if anyone's interested, you can always reach out to us. We provide training to the community. All right. So the importance of childhood positive experiences, they promote children's health and well-being. They allow children to form strong relationships and meaningful connections. They cultivate positive self-image and self-worth. So that's another important point, especially when discussing weight. I remember being, I think, 12, and my doctor telling me that I was overweight and that I was too short. And I have literally thought about that my entire life. No matter how I've changed or how I've grown or how my body has changed, I remember that conversation and I'm like, I am short and overweight, right? And even though my thinking has changed and I've grown up and obviously I've worked on my self-esteem, those things that still kind of circulates in my brain, you know? And so just remembering that we can have an impact even in one small interaction. And that isn't to scare anybody, just to kind of share that, you know, our interactions are important. We never know how we're impacting somebody's life. So just something to kind of think about, that the relationship with your doctor is an important one. And it's something that your patient thinks about, you know? And then provide a sense of belonging, build skills to cope with stress in healthy ways, and then protect adult mental health. So this might seem a bit broad and not maybe kind of abstract, but there are opportunities for moments of hope. So these can occur in each encounter. So every encounter you have with the patient, during intake and assessment. So this can be when your receptionist is talking to them, or the nurse is taking them in and doing the weight and blood pressure and things like that. When sharing referrals or community resources. So if you're in the space to actually talk through, you know, some resources available to them, if there's some type of food insecurity or some education that's needed around nutrition or exercise, then that's an opportunity to implement the HOPE framework. When making your policies and your procedures in your offices, and then when designing any type of programming. So I don't know if there's some, you know, I know that some offices and some clinics do like health education and things like that. So when thinking through those things, these are all opportunities for thinking about the building blocks of hope. And finally, this is just kind of a call to community action, thinking through what you can do, ways to implement change, ways to use strengths-based approaches with your clients and patients. And just remembering that we live in a community and we're all intermingling of all types of experiences. Like Ariane had shared, we're a bunch of cultures, we're a bunch of people. We're all trying to make it work and do the best for our families, including ourselves and the people that we're serving. So just something to sort of keep in mind as we move through these kind of tough discussions around health and nutrition and things like that. And that is it. Is there anything you'd like to add, Ariane?
I think only to that, we really talk a lot about creating a sense of belonging, because that is such a primary need for us as humans. And so I think of all these policies, if you can sum it up in one, are they promoting a sense of belonging? Are policies and practices being reactive, or are they being responsive? That's a way that I like to kind of just put a button on it. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you too. It's so, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I was going to open it to see if other people had questions as well, but I might start off the conversation because I know throughout you kind of asked us a few questions. And I think maybe people didn't feel like coming off mute at the time, but the building blocks of hope, the work that Bob Stagey has done, and he's been mentioned a couple times now by Dr. Gidwani, by you all. I actually worked with him when I was in Boston. Mm-hmm. So his work is quite interesting, and this framework of building hope is something I think, at least for the physicians on the call, because I know what that training looks like. It's not how we're trained. And you two talk about these are things that we should be doing and addressing, but I think, I guess I wonder, I think it goes against some of our natural processes or how we've been trained as a physician to look for the negative, and that picture you showed at the very beginning, we've been trained many, many years to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit about, you talk about what those tenets are and what they are, but any tips on how to practically do that? I saw Liliana put in here, talking about cultural humility, and just being humble in general, I think is something that lends itself to this kind of thinking. But how do we do this? How do you?
Yeah. No, I think that's such a good point, because you're right. It is antithetical to how you've been trained, right? To look for what's wrong. The building that type 1 thinking is what got you through school and got you through all of these things. And that's why you're good at tracking, what you are. And so I think it's just remembering that we have two sides of it. We need to balance out our skills, right? And the slower thinking is type 1 thinking helps us to be, quick and agile, but it's not the best to nurture human relationships, right? Because it's very reactive. And so in order to be a more well-rounded human, we need to engage with the type 2 more. And thankfully neuroplasticity facilitates that, right? But I think you're right. The thing that I've really enjoyed in going through this hope training from Dr. Stagey is that ACEs was so groundbreaking. And I think for me personally, on paper, I don't have a very high ACEs score, but on paper, you would have thought that I would have had more adverse endings to my life, right? But really looking at the PCEs, they all communicate. The reason they make such an impact is because if you look at them, they all enforce a sense of belonging in some way, right? Were my feelings heard? Did someone, did I have acceptance when I was an adolescent? All of those things are communicating a sense of belonging, which is why they help mitigate all those adverse effects. And so I think those 4 building blocks are helpful in just thinking, okay, those are the 4 major categories that I can help families and children thrive. how can I promote belonging in each of those categories? And even as a physician, those moments that they're in your office, and like Brandi was saying, from the moment they walk in, are they being welcomed and received and nurtured, or are they being just shuffled and managed? Because we all sense that, right? We can, as humans, we understand that energy and react to it even if we're not conscious of it. So how can we get ahead of it? I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah, I can just add a couple things too. So I also want to say that all of the things that we talked about today also applies to you. You are also living through this trauma. You also have had your own traumas and your own experiences, your own negative and positive, so also give yourself compassion too, that these are big changes. We all go through life. I mean, until we learn this stuff, I was real negative too. I was always like, oh, everything's terrible, blah, blah, blah. Right. Because we're all focusing on that type of thing. And if you have trauma, your brain even more so wants to protect itself. Right. So we want to give you the grace to just not feel like you immediately need to change your office and build this huge program about, you know what I mean? There's so many small ways to kind of just shift your thing. Even if the only change is, I'm going to make sure my receptionist is very warm and inviting. I'm going to make sure I know what resources are important to the community I'm specifically serving. So like if you do have a high refugee population, what resources in the community do I have? Are there specific food banks that respond to the culture of the person I'm trying to help? Those are really small things that you can do that are going to have big impacts, right? And then just thinking over time, what in a year can I have a translator here that helps me speak Farsi to the people in my community, or whatever it is. So I would say don't, jump into problem solve mode. Just kind of say, what are some small changes that I can do today? Can I put up a bright painting when people walk in that says welcome? People really, can I put a rainbow flag in the corner if I in a community where people, may not feel as comfortable? Just things like that. So I would say, just like some small, maybe perspective shifting, and then just some small little changes, I think over time builds something bigger. So I would just, kind of offer that as well.
Yeah, those small significant changes are the key to any change management, right? So not feeling so overwhelmed about like, oh shoot, I have to start from scratch. No. And remembering that there's assets and deficits to both thinking, right? So we need to just honor all of it.
Yeah, thank you. Vanessa?
Wendy mentioned in the chat, and then I know Vanessa, you have your hand up, but I just wanted to mention Wendy's comment. She said that we have patient problem lists. Can we start making patient asset lists, which is, I think, a great suggestion. And that she started asking these questions and patients are actually confused and thrown off because they're not used to this approach in the office, right? And it's true. You guys have had to manage because of that, how our system is built. You're just trying to get everyone attended to. And that is a lot to manage because you're not set up for success. So it's challenging when you have to slow down and input these little practices, which I think, Wendy, that's such a great, method of doing it.
Yeah, so, I'm loving what I'm seeing in the chat. Those are wonderful ideas.
Yeah. Vanessa, go ahead.
So that's a segue into my question, is kind of the elephant in the room is time. I think one of the biggest things I have tried to do with the ACEs training that we received is incorporate more of a trauma-informed approach, but those sensitive conversations do take time, and they take a centering of myself when I'm starting to have those moments with my patients. When I have 15 minutes, right? It's like such a short amount of time to address everything in a well child check. So my question is, I don't know if you would know this or if anyone in the conference knows, but are there any policy type movement changes to make well child checks longer? Because I feel like we are in this catch-22 cycle. If I refer them to a nutritionist or say, hey, come back in a month and let's do 15 minutes of just talking about nutrition, I often don't get a follow-up, especially in COVID. And I often see that they don't use the referral.
Yeah, we don't have that answer, but I'm really hoping that someone in this conference does, because I think that's a great point. Policy needs to support these practices, right? So that's why we're having these conversations.
Yeah, I don't know if Dr. Goodwani is still here or able to speak to that, but that would be, if anyone, I'm putting him on the spot.
Well, I think again, it's a collective approach. So first and foremost, I think we have to step back and not put the pediatrician in the position of being by themselves. I think we need to have a team-wide approach, and I think we need to have a resetting of values. And for those of you in pediatrics, this value-based stuff is some other nonsense that these pencil pushers have come up with. But let's be honest and say that collectively we need to move towards a team model where we have pediatricians, we have nurse practitioners who work as a team with community health workers, as well as folks within their practice, so that we have people inside and outside. Now, interestingly enough, for some of my colleagues that are in private practice, I think that model's true. It would be a little different socioeconomically, but it doesn't mean it has to be different. I think that same approach of all the pressure that's on you as a pediatrician by yourself in your office is too much, and it's just not fair. And like we say, children do not come into the office by themselves, because if they do, we have to call CPS. Likewise, pediatricians should not have to take care of families by themselves. We need to have this as a holistic approach. One of the things that you said that was so important and something that we really have to look at, again, this is beyond the pediatrician's scope because they're just too busy. The reparative, restorative relationships are the key. So if you think about it, attachment and attachment theory becomes critical. And what we've seen in Healthy Development Services, our program that treats kids with mild to moderate developmental behavioral concerns, is when there's a care coordinator with a mental health professional, great things happen, right? So the family's supported by more than one person. The mental health professional is not doing care coordination, which, I joked when I worked in a community clinic, I was doing care coordination. Bad choice. I was the most expensive person and I wasn't that good, right? And the piece too is that Wendy Pavlich is putting a good note in the chat about, how do you keep teams consistent? Yes, we have to stop thinking from the productivity model that accountants and pencil pushers do. But what we need people who think, okay, if the pediatrician is indeed that person that's the captain of the ship or one of the team members of the ship, who's going to keep that team consistent? Who's going to run that? Who's going to have that dynamic? How are you going to make sure there's time for people to meet? Additionally, how do you make sure there's time for things like reflective practice for pediatricians, for all staff, so that they're not getting impacted by secondary trauma, right? So again, people say to me, you're unrealistic. And I say, well, no, we actually know what works. It's just as a society, we're not committed to paying for it. So in the long run, that's what we need to do. We need to come together. We need to put together an agenda and an advocacy platform and say, this is what we need. And so I'll stop there without getting into my piece about we need to make this a lot better for mothers and having things like universal childcare, not just TK. So anyways, I will stop there, Kay.
Thank you, Dr. Bunny.
Yeah.
And we're with you. I think that team approach is key. And we're seeing it's a culture shift that we're all engaging in. And so for us who are not, engaging with physicians on a daily basis like you are, and we're just happy to be here having these conversations because we know that in each sector we need to start thinking differently and thinking in a team way, right? And even in our sector, we're talking about this movement from being mandated reporters to mandated supporters. And it's the same idea that we are interdependent and we need to, our programs and policies and approaches need to reflect that interdependence. So, thank you. Yeah.
So one thing I just wanted to mention, because we're cutting into our break time, Angie mentioned something about creating new policies within your system or your network and then expanding it, basically acting as a demonstration project. And so one thing I wanted to throw out there, we are all bad at billing. And I was recently at, I don't remember where now, but listing that your patients are food insecure increases the severity of your patient and will increase your the severity level of your patient encounter, and you can increase your billing at that point. So I'm just thinking, we have to think about ways to increase what we get reimbursed so that we can use some of that extra revenue, I think, to build some of this network and team-based approaches, because it's harder to make the policy change if we think creatively within our offices to start making these changes and be a demonstration project. I think, that may be another way to go, unless we can get Pradeep to go make policy changes in the California legislature.
I'm not running for office as much as I like that.